Something very unusual happens when both you and a narcissist stop contacting each other. The silence doesn't just end the relationship, it changes the entire psychological game. Because when neither of you reaches out, the narcissist enters a mental space they are not used to, a place where control disappears and uncertainty begins. Today, we're exploring what really happens when both sides go completely silent, and why this type of silence can become one of the most powerful boundaries you ever create. Subscribe if you want to understand the psychology behind narcissistic behavior. Comment, "Silence is my power," if you've chosen peace over chaos. Share this video with someone who needs strength to maintain no contact. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. One of the most powerful dynamics that unfolds when both you and a narcissist go no contact is what can be called the silent power shift. This shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, but psychologically it changes everything about the relationship. In narcissistic dynamics, power is rarely about loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it often revolves around access, reaction, and emotional influence. When communication suddenly stops from both sides, that entire structure begins to collapse, and the balance of power starts to change in ways the narcissist is not used to. In most narcissistic relationships, the narcissist operates with an expectation of availability. They assume that the people in their lives will respond to them, whether that response comes through admiration, anger, explanations, or attempts to fix the relationship. Even negative reactions can serve a purpose because they still confirm that the narcissist has an emotional impact. When someone argues, defends themselves, or tries to be understood, they are still participating in the dynamic. That participation keeps the narcissist in a position of influence. But when both people stop contacting each other, something unusual happens. The emotional supply that once fueled the interaction disappears. There are no more messages to interpret, no arguments to dominate, no apologies to manipulate, and no emotional reactions to feed on. The silence creates a vacuum where the narcissist's usual strategies no longer function. For someone who is accustomed to maintaining control through interaction, this absence of engagement can feel disorienting. The power shift begins because silence removes predictability. Narcissists often rely on predictable emotional patterns in others. They know how to trigger guilt, provoke anger, or draw sympathy, and they use those patterns to maintain influence. When communication stops completely, those patterns disappear. The narcissist can no longer rely on their usual methods because there is no audience to react to them. At first, the narcissist may assume that the silence is temporary. They might believe the other person is simply cooling off or waiting for the right moment to reconnect. This belief allows them to maintain a sense of control, at least in their own mind. They may think that eventually the other person will miss them, become curious, or feel the need to reach out. Because narcissists often expect others to seek closure or emotional resolution, they assume the silence will eventually break. However, as time passes and the silence continues, the psychological landscape begins to change. The narcissist realizes that the person who once responded to them is no longer participating in the dynamic. This realization can be deeply unsettling because it removes a source of emotional influence they once relied on. Without access to the other person's thoughts, feelings, or reactions, the narcissist loses an important point of reference for their own sense of importance. This is where the silent power shift becomes significant. The person who maintains no contact is no longer reacting to the narcissist's behavior. They are no longer explaining themselves, defending their feelings, or trying to repair the relationship. By stepping out of the interaction completely, they remove themselves from the system that allowed the narcissist to maintain control. For many people who have experienced narcissistic relationships, this shift can feel strange at first. Silence can create a sense of uncertainty. Questions may arise. Should I say something? Do they think I don't care? Are they waiting for me to respond? These questions are natural because narcissistic relationships often train people to stay engaged emotionally, even when the interaction is painful. But the absence of engagement is exactly what changes the dynamic. The narcissist no longer has the ability to provoke reactions or shape the conversation. Instead of controlling the emotional rhythm of the relationship, they are left with uncertainty about what the other person is thinking or feeling. This uncertainty is something narcissists often struggle with because it places them outside the center of the interaction. Over time, the silence begins to redefine the relationship itself. What was once a cycle of reaction and control becomes a closed chapter. Without communication to revive old patterns, the emotional intensity gradually fades. The narcissist may still think about the situation, but they can no longer actively shape it through manipulation or persuasion. For the person who initiated no contact, the silent power shift can be one of the most empowering aspects of the process. It represents a movement away from emotional dependency and toward independence. Instead of constantly reacting to the narcissist's behavior, they reclaim the ability to focus on their own peace, stability, and personal growth. In the end, the power shift does not happen through confrontation or victory in an argument. It happens quietly through absence. The decision to remain silent removes the foundation on which the narcissistic dynamic once stood, and in that silence, the person who once felt controlled begins to rediscover something that may have been missing for a long time: true emotional freedom. When both you and a narcissist go no contact, one of the most important psychological dynamics that unfolds is the narcissist's internal conflict. From the outside, the silence may look calm, clean, and uneventful. There are no messages, no arguments, no dramatic attempts to reconnect. It can even appear as if the narcissist has simply moved on without a second thought. But internally, the situation is often far more complicated than it appears. Narcissists rely heavily on interaction to regulate their sense of self. Their identity and confidence are often reinforced through attention, admiration, and emotional reactions from others. Even conflict can serve this function because it still keeps the narcissist in the center of the emotional exchange. When both sides suddenly stop communicating, that source of stimulation disappears. The narcissist is left without the usual feedback that helps them measure their importance and influence. This absence creates a quiet psychological tension. On one hand, the narcissist wants to maintain the appearance of control. Reaching out first could feel like admitting that the other person's absence matters to them. Because narcissists often place great importance on appearing powerful and unaffected, they may resist the urge to contact the other person even if curiosity or irritation begins to grow. Maintaining silence allows them to preserve the illusion that they are above the situation. On the other hand, the lack of information about what the other person is doing can slowly become uncomfortable. Narcissists tend to assume that people who were once emotionally connected to them will continue thinking about them or missing them. When communication stops completely, the narcissist cannot easily confirm whether this assumption is true. They may begin wondering whether the other person still cares, whether they have moved on, or whether they are happier without the relationship. This curiosity is often mixed with ego sensitivity. The narcissist may ask themselves questions that they rarely confront directly. Did that person really choose to walk away? Are they able to live peacefully without me? Do they think I was the problem? These questions challenge the narcissist's internal narrative of superiority, so they can create subtle discomfort. Even if the narcissist quickly pushes these thoughts aside, the uncertainty still lingers beneath the surface. At the same time, the narcissist may attempt to reassure themselves that the silence does not matter. They might convince themselves that the relationship was not that significant or that the other person was too difficult to deal with. These mental reframes serve an important psychological purpose. By minimizing the importance of the relationship, the narcissist protects their ego from the possibility that they lost something meaningful. However, this self-protection does not always eliminate the internal tension completely. Narcissists are often very aware of how relationships affect their image and influence. The fact that someone who once invested in them has chosen total silence can quietly challenge their perception of themselves as someone who is difficult to leave behind. Another layer of internal conflict appears when the narcissist thinks about whether to reach out. Part of them may feel tempted to test the silence, perhaps by sending a message or making a casual attempt at communication. But another part of them resists this idea because reaching out first could feel like surrendering control. Narcissists often want to remain in a position where others pursue them rather than the other way around. This internal tug-of-war can continue for quite some time. The narcissist may alternate between curiosity and dismissal, between wondering about the other person and telling themselves the situation is irrelevant. Because narcissists tend to avoid deep self-reflection, they rarely process these emotions openly. Instead, the conflict stays internal, surfacing occasionally through thoughts, memories, or moments of irritation. For the person who has chosen no contact, it is important to understand that the narcissist's silence does not necessarily mean they are unaffected. Silence can be strategic, protective, or simply a way for them to avoid confronting uncomfortable emotions. The narcissist may not be experiencing regret in the same way a healthy individual might, but the disruption of the relationship can still create psychological tension. What makes this stage particularly interesting is that the narcissist cannot resolve the conflict through their usual methods. In the past, they may have relied on arguments, charm, persuasion, or emotional pressure to restore the connection. But when both sides remain silent, those tools are no longer available. The narcissist is left with unanswered questions and a situation they cannot easily control. Over time, they may attempt to reduce this internal tension by shifting their focus elsewhere, seeking new attention, or creating a new narrative about what happened. But the initial period of silence often contains this quiet struggle between curiosity, ego protection, and the desire to maintain control. For someone maintaining no contact, this understanding can be empowering. The silence is not empty, it changes the emotional structure of the relationship. By refusing to participate in the cycle of reaction and engagement, you remove the environment that once allowed the narcissistic dynamic to thrive. And in that absence, the narcissist is left with something they rarely experience, a situation where their usual influence no longer works. One of the most fascinating dynamics that unfolds when both you and a narcissist go no contact is what can be described as the waiting game. On the surface, the silence may appear mutual and calm, almost as if both people simply decided to move on with their lives. But psychologically, many narcissists approach this silence with a very specific expectation. They believe the other person will eventually break it first. Narcissists often operate from a deep assumption that people who once cared about them cannot easily detach. In many of their past relationships, emotional conflicts have followed a predictable pattern. There may have been arguments, distance, or moments of separation, but eventually the other person returned. Sometimes that return happened because the person wanted closure, reassurance, or emotional resolution. Other times it happened because the narcissist used charm, guilt, or pressure to reopen communication. Because of these past experiences, narcissists frequently believe that silence is temporary. When both sides stop contacting each other, the narcissist may interpret the situation not as a final ending, but as a pause in the emotional cycle. They assume that time will eventually weaken the other person's resolve. In their mind, it is only a matter of time before curiosity, nostalgia, or emotional attachment leads the other person to reach out again. This expectation creates the foundation of the waiting game. The narcissist chooses to remain silent not necessarily because they feel indifferent, but because they believe silence will work in their favor. By waiting, they maintain the illusion of control. If the other person reaches out first, it confirms the narcissist's belief that they still hold emotional influence. During this stage, the narcissist may adopt an attitude of calm patience. They might tell themselves that the other person simply needs time to process the situation or realize what they lost. Narcissists often assume that their absence will eventually be felt as a void. They may believe the person will miss the attention, the intensity, or the connection that once existed. This belief allows the narcissist to sit back and wait rather than risk appearing vulnerable by reaching out first. At the same time, the narcissist may quietly watch for signs that their assumption is correct. If the person posts on social media, interacts with mutual friends, or appears to be living their life normally, the narcissist may interpret these actions in different ways. Sometimes they convince themselves the person is pretending to be happy while secretly struggling. Other times they assume the person is simply distracting themselves until they feel ready to reconnect. What the narcissist rarely expects is that the silence might truly continue. In their experience, many people eventually feel compelled to resolve emotional tension. Humans naturally seek closure, understanding, or reconciliation. Narcissists rely on this tendency because it often leads people back into the conversation. But when someone maintains strong boundaries and does not break the silence, the waiting game becomes more complicated. The narcissist begins to notice that the expected message or apology never arrives. Days turn into weeks, and weeks may turn into months. The assumption that the other person will eventually reach out begins to weaken. This is when the psychological pressure of the waiting game can increase for the narcissist. Their patience was built on the belief that time would bring the other person back into the dynamic. When that does not happen, the silence stops feeling like a temporary pause and starts looking more like a real separation. However, narcissists often resist acknowledging this shift openly. Admitting that the other person has truly moved on would challenge their sense of importance. Instead, they may continue maintaining the narrative that the silence does not matter to them. They might tell others that they simply chose not to contact the person anymore, or that they lost interest. Yet internally, the unresolved nature of the situation can remain uncomfortable. Narcissists prefer endings that they control. In the waiting game, they are not fully in control of the outcome because the other person's silence cannot be predicted or influenced. This uncertainty can linger quietly in the background of their thoughts. For the person who initiated no contact, understanding this stage can be very empowering. Many people assume that silence means the narcissist has forgotten about them or never cared at all. In reality, the narcissist may simply be waiting for the emotional cycle to restart. They are betting on the idea that eventually you will reach out, respond, or seek closure. But when you maintain the boundary and refuse to break the silence, something important happens. The waiting game loses its power. The narcissist's expectation that you will return begins to collapse, and the dynamic that once kept the relationship alive gradually dissolves. In the end, the waiting game reveals a central truth about narcissistic dynamics. Much of their sense of control depends on others continuing to participate emotionally. When you step out of that cycle and remain silent, you remove the stage on which the narcissist expected the story to continue, and without that stage, the entire dynamic begins to fade. Another powerful shift that occurs when both you and a narcissist go no contact is the gradual loss of control that the narcissist begins to experience. Control is one of the quiet engines behind many narcissistic dynamics. It is not always obvious or aggressive. Sometimes it shows up as subtle influence, emotional pressure, or the ability to shape how conversations and situations unfold. But when communication completely stops, that ability to steer the relationship begins to disappear. In most narcissistic relationships, the narcissist is used to having some level of influence over the emotional environment. They may decide when conversations happen, how conflicts are framed, or when reconciliation occurs. Even when the relationship is tense or chaotic, the narcissist often believes they still have access to the other person's attention and reactions. That access gives them a sense of power. No contact interrupts that pattern in a very direct way. When both sides stop communicating, the narcissist suddenly loses the channel through which they usually exercise influence. They cannot provoke a reaction, explain their version of events, shift blame, or charm their way back into emotional relevance. The tools they typically use to manage relationships simply do not work in silence. At first, the narcissist may not fully recognize this loss of control. They might assume that the silence is temporary or that they can reconnect whenever they decide the time is right. This belief allows them to maintain the illusion that they still have authority over the situation. In their mind, the relationship is paused, not truly beyond their reach. But as time passes, the reality of the situation becomes clearer. The narcissist begins to notice that the other person is not reacting, not responding, and not participating in the old patterns anymore. The usual emotional hooks no longer produce results. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges a deeply ingrained expectation, the belief that they can always re-enter the dynamic when they choose. The absence of reaction is particularly powerful. Narcissistic dynamics often rely on emotional engagement, whether positive or negative. Praise, admiration, arguments, frustration, even tears, all of these responses signal that the narcissist still has an impact. When someone goes no contact and maintains it, those signals disappear completely. Without that feedback, the narcissist cannot easily measure their importance in the other person's life. They may begin wondering whether their influence has truly ended. This uncertainty is uncomfortable because narcissists typically prefer environments where they can predict and control the emotional flow of relationships. Another aspect of this loss of control involves the narrative of the relationship. Narcissists often try to shape how events are interpreted. In the past, they may have explained conflicts in ways that protected their image, minimized their behavior, or redirected responsibility onto the other person. When communication stops, that opportunity to manage the narrative becomes limited. The other person is now free to interpret the past without interference. They may reflect on what happened, set new boundaries, or talk to others about their experiences. The narcissist can no longer guide or manipulate those conversations. From the narcissist's perspective, this lack of influence can feel like the story is being written without their participation. Over time, this shift changes the emotional balance of the relationship. The person who maintains no contact begins to regain autonomy and clarity. They are no longer caught in cycles of explanation, defense, or emotional negotiation. Their energy is no longer directed toward managing the narcissist's reactions. Meanwhile, the narcissist is left outside the dynamic they once shaped. They may still attempt to preserve their sense of superiority by convincing themselves that the silence does not matter. They might tell themselves that they chose the distance or that the other person was never important enough to pursue, but the underlying truth remains. The structure that once allowed them to control the emotional environment is gone. The silence has removed the stage on which their influence operated. For many people who have been in narcissistic relationships, understanding this shift can be deeply empowering. It highlights that no contact is not simply about avoiding someone, it is about changing the entire structure of the interaction. Without access to your attention, your reactions, and your emotional investment, the narcissistic dynamic loses the mechanisms that once sustained it. The longer the silence continues, the more the balance of power shifts. What once felt like a relationship dominated by confusion, pressure, or emotional turbulence gradually becomes a space defined by distance and personal boundaries. And in that quiet space, something important happens. The narcissist's ability to control the rhythm of the relationship fades, while your ability to control your own emotional world grows stronger. That transformation is one of the most significant outcomes of true no contact.